Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast. This is Vlad Zamfira, and today we will continue the discussion from the previous episode about Venetian Cyprus and its demise. In the previous episode, I talked about more socio-economic accounts of 16th century Cyprus from Elias of Pesaro, Christopher Führer, and Falchetti. Now, I will read parts from the accounts of Diedo, Paruta, and Calepio, who wrote in great detail about the horrendous sieges of Nicosia and the siege of Famagusta, which by 1571 remained the last and arguably strongest Venetian outpost in Cyprus. Now, just to have a very short resume to make a distinction between what happened in Nicosia and the events of Famagusta. As I said in the previous episode, Nicosia was the landlocked capital of Venetian Cyprus, and most of the Cypriot nobility resided there. Yet refortifications by 1570 were in a precarious state, the town lacked military personnel, and the garrison was ran by an incompetent lieutenant called Niccolò Dandolo. On the other hand, Famagusta had a solid, well-defended harbor, was heavily fortified, and had an adequate defense force. And it also had the fortunate help of Marco Querini, who managed to destroy part of the Ottoman reinforcements and supplies from Caramania and Syria in 1570. By the end of 1570, Famagusta represented the thread of hope left for the Venetians, who hoped that the Ottomans would eventually give up and abandon Cyprus, as they did in Malta in 1565. Yet that would not happen. For Cyprus, unlike Malta, was a couple of hours away from Ottoman ports, such as Alexandria or Tripoli, meaning that the Ottomans could pour reinforcements for as long as it took to conquer Famagusta and the whole of Cyprus. Now back to the reports. Giacomo Diedo, now from the very beginning, he was actually not in Cyprus, or not even contemporary with the events of the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War between 1570 and 1573. He was actually an 18th century Venetian senator who in 1751 published a 4-volume history about the Venetian Republic. He also drew a lot of inspiration from Paolo Paruta, arguably one of the greatest Venetian historians from the early modern period and overall Venetian history. Now, the account of Diedo is more focused on the military aspect of the conquest of Cyprus. He has a very short introduction about what happened in Cyprus before the Venetian acquisition in 1489. So at one point he says, quote, "Cyprus, henceforth reduced to a province, was defended down to the time of which we are about to speak against the turbulence of its inhabitants and the jealousies of its neighbors by the power of Venice." Unquote. Now, Diedo realizes that there was profound turmoil in Cyprus, and again he mentions the turbulence of its inhabitants and jealousies of its neighbors. Now, by jealousies of its neighbors, Diedo refers mainly to the Ottomans and to a smaller extent the Greeks and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who again were under the rule of the Porte and the Sultan. He resumes, quote, "But now the Turkish Sultan Selim, who coveted the island, set himself to attempt its conquest, waving aside the considerations which had weighed with his predecessors, that the enterprise was difficult in itself and certain to stir up against his empire the forces of the Christian princes, joined to the powerful armaments of the Venetians." Unquote. Now, Diedo, having written this by the mid-18th century, he of course knew what happened beforehand. So the considerations of his predecessors, by that he means the fact that Suleiman the Magnificent never really attempted to conquer Cyprus, because after the Third Ottoman-Venetian War between 1537 and 1540, Suleiman saw no need to wage war against the Venetians. He was quite pleased with the capitulations. The Ottomans gained a bit more land. The Ottomans would pay tribute. And generally, Suleiman the Magnificent was focused more on war against the Spanish with Philip II, but also the Holy Roman Empire. Now, there's also another person brought into question here, and that's the Grand Vizier Mehmed Sokoli or Sokolovich. And he was quite pro-Venetian in most cases. The fact that the war against Venice was delayed until 1570 is largely attributed by historians such as Hamar or Nicolae Iorga to Sokoli, who saw no point in the Ottomans trying to go and conquer Cyprus, because Cyprus was not, from the Ottoman perspective, it was not that valuable in a pragmatic sense of the word. Now, Sultan Selim II, also known as the Sot because most of the time he was drunkard and he had an affinity for cheap Cypriot wines, funnily enough, is a different story because he was nothing like his father. His father was basically a Julius Caesar or Trajan of the Ottoman Empire, expanded the empire beyond belief. Now, in 1566, Suleiman dies, Selim II succeeds him as Ottoman Sultan, and for about 4 years until 1570, the Ottomans don't record any notable victories, and Selim was very much in need of that because he wanted to build his mosque. It was a bit of a Ottoman tradition that newly instated sultans would build a mosque, and the mosque would actually be the one at in Adrianople, in Edirne, so the Soleimani mosque. However, there was this Ottoman law which basically stated that a new ruler, a new sultan, had to build that mosque from loot gained from a conquest. In other words, he could not just go to the treasury, get all of the money, and build his mosque. So for about 4 years until 1570, Selim II was in a continuous quest, I would say, to look for new territories to annex. He really needed a conquest to fund his mosque. And he needed a quick win to boost morale for the Janissaries, because if he stood stagnant for about more than 5 years, the situation could have gotten worse. Tensions at the Porte were always rife. Also, in terms of future conquests for Selim II, the options were quite limited because the situation was rather pacified with the Holy Roman Empire and the truce signed with the emperor. The situation was stable in the east with the Persians. After the siege of Malta in 1565, there was a bit of a stalemate between the Spanish Empire led by Philip II and the Ottoman Empire as well. Malta represented the bastion from which the Ottomans could not really go forward. Most of North Africa was conquered by his father Suleiman. The situation in Rumelia, as in the European continental Ottoman lands, today's Greece, Bulgaria, Wallachia, those were already conquered. So there were limited options, and again, time was running short. And apparently, the most viable option to conquer was actually Cyprus, and it made a lot of sense from someone who was eager to make a quick conquest like Selim was. In fact, from a geographic perspective, Cyprus was the most accessible Ottoman target because it was extremely close to most Ottoman provinces, such as the ones in Anatolia, the Karamania, Syria, Egypt, and most of the Greek archipelago. So that technically meant that the matter of supply was taken care of, because if the Ottomans would require, let's say, extra troops or extra supplies, it would only take them about 8 hours for them to be shipped from Ottoman outposts to Cyprus. This whole ambition of Selim to conquer Cyprus created basically two factions in the Ottoman government: the pro Venetian faction, which included Mehmed Sokoli, the Grand Vizier, and on the other side, the pro-Cyprus conquest faction, which included the Sultan, most of the Pashas, and also Joseph Nasi. Joseph Nasi, or João Miguel, he was a very interesting figure and character, sort of a consultant for Sultan Selim II, who, fair to say, he had grudges against the Inquisition, against France, Spain. His family was banished from Venice, and he was an incredibly influential figure at the Porte in Constantinople. One of his main objectives was to provide a safe haven for persecuted Jews, European Jews, and at first he tried to resurrect the city of Tiberias, the ancient Jewish city. That worked up to a point when his aunt Donna Garcia, she died, and then support for Tiberias faded. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, with the accounts of Führer and Elias of Pesaro, Cyprus actually had a sizable Jewish population, which meant that Cyprus was a viable option for Nasi. Now, Joseph Nasi envisioned himself, once Cyprus was conquered, as the ruler, the king of Cyprus, as in 1566 or so, you have the Duchy of Naxos, who was basically given by Selim II to Nasi. The financier and advisor had high hopes that once Cyprus would be conquered, he would become the king, effectively the king of Cyprus. And subsequently, he wanted to turn Cyprus into a haven for European persecuted Jews. Now, as Diedo said himself, the enterprise was difficult in itself and certain to stir up against his empire the forces of Christian princes joined to the powerful armaments of the Venetians. And by that he meant the Holy League, which eventually was comprised of Spanish, Papal, a bit Italian forces as well, the Knights Templar from Malta, and Venice. Now, while this Holy League did not recover Cyprus for the Venetians, and actually the Venetians would lose the Fourth Venetian Ottoman War, the Holy League delivered a crippling blow to the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. About the Battle of Lepanto, I will talk in a separate episode, but fair to say that the common belief was that while it was a huge spectacle and a big victory for the Holy League forces, the Battle of Lepanto had no solid consequence. Voltaire said it was a spectacle with basically no effects. I disagree with that, because the Battle of Lepanto basically meant that the Ottomans had to spend so much money on rebuilding their fleet in less than a year that at one point Mehmed Sokoli, who again at the beginning he was the pro-Venetian faction, and he said that starting a war against Venice by trying to conquer Cyprus will bring Spain and the papacy against the Ottoman Empire, and that it might lead to a possible defeat, which actually happened at Lepanto. So to quickly conclude on this point, while it seemed as a feasible good idea for the Ottoman Sultan Selim II to go and conquer Cyprus, because he hoped that somehow the Venetians would willingly cede Cyprus to the Porte, which of course they didn't, it actually started a huge war which had tremendous implications on not just the Christian factions from the Holy League, but also the Ottoman treasury as well. So while, yes, by the end of 1573, the Venetians had capitulated and Cyprus was thus incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, the cost was far too greater. But now to return to the account of Diedo. Quote, however, one day he, the Sultan, went out hunting with his principal pashas, the Turks call an assembly of this kind a mounted divan, and laid the question before them. The opinions at first were various. Mehmed, the Grand Vizier, maintaining that it would be more to the advantage and glory of the empire to carry its arms in another direction, either against Spain, to check its aggrandizement and to set free the Moors of Granada, or against places which might pave the way to conquest in the fairest provinces of Europe. The kingdom of Cyprus was, he said, jealously guarded by the Venetians, the forts fully supplied with troops and artillery, and on the mere report that they would be attacked, the Republic had added wonderfully to the fortifications and fastnesses. It ought not to be difficult to the troops of Venice to prevent a landing and to surprise vessels whose best men would be away, employed in the siege of the fortresses, and again, if on the rumor of an attack the Christian powers were stirred to a common defense, how difficult would this task undertaken by the Porte of carrying on a war in violation of their pledges, and so soon after the signing of treaties of peace. On these grounds, prudence and the interests of the empire recommended that the acquisition of the kingdom of Cyprus should be deferred to a more convenient season, and that the Venetians should be lulled with the prospects of peace until they could be taken defenseless and unawares. Piali and Mustafa Pasha were of the opposite opinion, though rather for their private ends and their hatred of Mehmed than for the real good of the empire. They suggested to the Sultan that the forces of his kingdom could not be directed to a worthier object than that of adding to it an island conveniently situated and serviceably rich, which harbored the corsairs of the Levant, who obstructed the free passage of the seas and were a danger and menace to Mussulmans on the voyage to Mecca. That the power of Venice was not sufficiently flourishing to resist the luck and valor of the Ottoman Empire, that the assistance of the princes of Christendom was uncertain and generally of little service, for past conflicts had made it clear that they might figure as an appendage or ornament, without being a substantial help to their allies. That the defense of the Cypriot strongholds and the very existence of the kingdom depended solely on a few garrisons, which would be reduced by privations and assaults before they could be reinforced by expeditions from other countries. That the natives of the island had through long peace laid aside their military habits. The feudal soldiers had abandoned the use of arms for ease and luxury, and in their stead were employed a low class of mercenaries. That an attack upon Spain would prove exceedingly difficult. The country was far off, mountainous, barren, and every step would cost blood and peril. Not but they must carry out the constant injunction of their ancestors to extend the empire by ever new conquests, and keep alive the vigor which spreads through the whole body of its outlying members. But they need not seek in scattered and remote regions the ephemeral glory of ideal conquests, whose achievement were difficult, and their maintenance certain to dissipate the power of the nation. Selim, encouraged by this reasoning, but still more incited by his own inclination for the enterprise, decided to carry it out, declaring that he would himself lead to the war a force worthy of his empire, and with his own royal presence offer resistance to any attack from the Christian princes. Setting aside therefore his project of uniting the Don and the Volga with a great canal, which was to facilitate his passage into Persia, having allayed certain risings of Arabs, and having received from the Pasha of Erzurum news of the peaceful disposition of the king of Persia, he issued strict orders for the construction of a large number of bomb vessels in the Gulf of Ayas and in the Mediterranean, for the fitting out with all speed of old galleys and the building of new vessels, and send express commands to the Beylerbey of Anatolia, Captain General of Asia Minor to concentrate the troops in all the provinces in Caramania. Such were the preparations of the Turks for an attack on the island of Cyprus, and although other pretexts were alleged to excuse them, common rumor and certain unmistakable signs made their purpose clear, as Marcantonio Barbaro, ambassador to the Porte, was able to assure the Senate. There were, however, not a few senators who flattered themselves that Selim would not, at the beginning of his reign, plunge into a difficult war, which might stir up the Christian princes to injure his empire. They clung to their opinion so obstinately as to impress on the Senate that they should use the greatest caution in their warlike preparations, so as not to divert the Turks from any other enterprise which they might have in view, and not to draw down on the Republic an attack which was probably designed for the injury of others. But ideas of delay were soon exchanged for those of anxious haste. When the Senate was assured by fresh dispatches from their ambassadors that the Turkish preparations were aimed solely at the island of Cyprus, everyone was excited to rivalry in making suggestions and in carrying out the decisions of the Senate. It was resolved to fit out 100 light galleys. 11 commanders were chosen for the large galleys, and Francesco Duodo, a man already illustrious in naval warfare, was appointed to lead them with the title of captain. The command of the armed ships was entrusted to Pietro Trono, and to increase the strength of the whole fleet, it was decided to man a galleon of extraordinary size whose bulk and strength should be the guard and stay of the smaller vessels. The command of this was given to Girolamo Contarini. The supreme command of the naval armaments was given to Girolamo Zane, procurator of St. Mark. He had been elected 2 years before, but had not set out and was considered legally entitled to remain in office. A naval force of considerable importance was thus in preparation, and no less energy was shown in reinforcing the garrison in the strongholds of Cyprus, Dalmatia, and others in the Levant. They were much strengthened in numbers, and their duties increased for the greater safety of the forts and the better discipline of the men. As, however, it was Cyprus rather than the other places which was threatened, the Senate hurried the departure of Eugenio Singlitico, a Cypriot noble who held the post of adjutant general of the land forces with 1,000 foot soldiers. Girolamo Martinengo, a condottiere, was sent there with 2,000 foreign infantry. And as the rumor of prompt pay drew from all parts mercenaries and captains of renown, all were accepted and transported with all speed to Cyprus. On July 1st, 1570, the Turkish fleet was descried off to the western point of Cyprus near Paphos. It sailed south and passed from Limisso to the promontory of Curium, Capo Delegati, ravaging the seashore and carrying off prisoners. The next day it arrived at the Salines and anchored off the marina on the east. There Mustafa, meeting no resistance, landed his men and guns and pushed on a few squadrons towards the interior to discover from prisoners the conditions of the country and its fortresses. This happy beginning gave them courage, and they won over to their side many of the inhabitants, taking special care to attract by promises and gifts the hill folk, whose fastness would have been difficult to reduce by force of arms. Mustafa was unwilling to commence the investment of the fortresses before he had collected round him all his troops and dispatched 80 galleys and other vessels to Tripoli and to Caramania to embark the whole of the land forces, so that in a few days he had assembled with the colors 50,000 infantry, 2,500 cavalry, as many more carriers, 3,000 pioneers, with 30 pieces of large artillery and 50 of lesser caliber. The garrisons of the Cypriot fortresses were ill-matched with so powerful an army. There were but 2,000 paid foot soldiers, 1,000 delle Cernide di Terraferma, and 2,000 with Martinengo. And these from various illnesses contracted through change of climate were daily reduced in number, so that all hope of defending the towns rested on the loyalty and courage of the islanders, always ready for feats of arms and ventures. The Stradiot horse hardly amounted to 500 because the feudal nobles who enjoyed revenues from the royal treasury with the condition of keeping 3 or 4 horses each no longer made use of such but employed mules, which are bred in the island of remarkable size, so that they could furnish scarcely 100 horses, and these more adapted for show than for use in war. The news of the Turkish landing spread throughout the island, and the inhabitants of the cities were filled with confusion and alarm at the thought that their whole hope of defense rested in the 2 fortresses of Nicosia and Famagusta. The first was strong and well supplied with artillery, but there were not enough troops to man the vast extent of the walls. Famagusta was small and weak and needed men of valor, whose strength and high spirit would make up for the defects of its fortifications. Men of authority were too lacking. Martinengo was dead, and there remained only Astore Baglione in command of the troops. The office of Governor-General was vacant by the death of Lorenzo Bembo, and though Sebastiano Veniero had been appointed by the Senate in his stead, he had no time to reach his post before the kingdom was overrun by the enemy. It became absolutely necessary to give the chief military commands to Cypriots of noble family. The Count di Rocas was made lieutenant to Baglione. Giacomo Mores, Count of Tripoli, took charge of the artillery, Giovanni Singlitico of the cavalry, Giovanni Sosomeno of the pioneers. Scipione Carafa and Pietro Paolo Singlitico were entrusted with the duty of collecting villagers to occupy the mountain passes. These, however, had more loyalty and smartness than experience in military matters, and there ensued some hesitation as to the way in which they should prevent the Turks from concentrating their attack on the fortresses. It seemed natural to take to the open country to block the roads and show a bold front, but their spirit was greater than their means. They had but few cavalry and not infantry enough to defend the walls, and if these men were scattered about in outposts, there would not be one to bring supplies to the cities. They resolved, however, to meet the enemy in the field, and the Count di Rocas, who had with great difficulty collected 300 horsemen, with 100 Italian musketeers on ponies, commanded by Antonio da Berettino and Lazzaro Cocapani, started from Nicosia, while Baglione left Famagusta with 300 mounted musketeers and 150 Stradiots, and the Cavalier Pietro Roncati came from Bafo with the few remaining horsemen. When they had met, they began to reflect seriously on the risk to which they were exposing this handful of men with whom rested the very existence of the kingdom, and that too without a chance of any signal success, their numbers bearing no proportion to those of the enemy. They determined accordingly to return to defend the fortresses, and so the Turks were left free to advance safely into the island, harrying and wasting the country at their will, and killing or making captive its inhabitants. The Turkish commanders, encouraged by this lucky beginning, debated where first to turn their arms. Piale maintained that the army should be led to the siege at Famagusta. It was easier to take, and the soldiers, cheered by the spoil, would be in better heart for the attack of Nicosia, a city situated in a vast plain, far from the sea, and containing an unwarlike population, which would be terror-struck at the fall of Famagusta and offer terms of capitulation without bloodshed. Mustafa differed and thought that before attacking Famagusta, they should make themselves masters of Nicosia, where were collected the riches of the kingdom. Its conquest would ensure them the possession of the island, of which Nicosia, from its position, dignity, and wealth, might be called the heart. Famagusta had been held by the Genoese for a space of 90 years without disturbing the Lusignan kings in their safe and peaceful possession of the rest of the kingdom. Supposing the Christian forces to arrive, the place could easily be recovered, for it was weak and situated in a corner of the kingdom. The honor and interest of the empire counseled the removal of the greater difficulties, nor could they doubt but that were Nicosia taken, the victorious ensigns of the Grand Signior would be planted on every fortress in the island. The camp was then moved towards Nicosia. The Turks found no opposition on the way. The inhabitants, through inconsistency of temperament or because the yoke of slavery imposed on them by the Cypriot nobles made them flatter themselves that they might find better luck under a new master, even offered them provisions and gave them to the fullest information as to the position of affairs and the condition of the island. The confusion of the commanders and the alarm of the people of Nicosia at the appearance of the Turkish army was incredible. They were as unready as though the event were wholly unexpected. The city, through the negligence of its chiefs, was poorly provided with grain. The trenches were not thoroughly dug out. The inhabitants were not disciplined, for up to this time so confident had they been that they would not be attacked, that they had quite lately disbanded the island troops called Cernide, and left the town undefended. Niccolo Dandolo had the chief command, a man unfit for so important a post, but generals were few, and a certain reputation acquired at sea seemed to point him out as competent to act under the direct orders of the Governor-General. But this post was unfortunately vacant. Everything was in confusion, but what measures the lack of time and of experience allowed the commanders took. The Cernide, who had scarcely got back to their villages, were recalled, and a decree was published allowing everyone who brought foodstuff into the city to sell it at its own terms. It was of little profit, for the peasants generally had become stupid and confused, and a very large quantity of grain, which might have been brought in for the use of the garrison, remained outside at the disposal and the advantage of the Turks. Their daring increased accordingly. They pitched their camp, set up their pavilions, and put their guns in position, while not a single Cypriot sallied from the town to interrupt the work. There were 10,000 infantry in Nicosia, all untried men collected from the villages of the island, and a reserve of 1,500 Italians. The number of pioneers was large, for besides the 4,000 under Sosomeno, many of the islanders had taken refuge within the city, but arms were fatally wanting, so that many soldiers took their turn off duty on the ramparts armed with spontoons and halberds for lack of pikes and muskets. The generals had little authority. The subaltern officers wavered in their obedience, and a force which had been sufficient for a vigorous resistance, had it been composed of disciplined and tried soldiers under proper commanders, was really weak and ineffective. And so it was that everyone felt that human means were weak indeed to resist so fierce an assault, and with general prayers and solemn processions they implored the favor of heaven. Warm impulse was given to the common devotion by the example and exhortations of Francesco Contarini, Bishop of Bafo, who, in the absence of Filippo Mocenigo, Archbishop of Nicosia, held the first place among the ecclesiastics of the kingdom. Unquote. And then Diedo discusses about the valiant efforts of the bishops to rally up the troops and the nobles together and the peasants, but it was all in vain, as the Ottomans realized that Nicosia would not be surrendered, so they increased their efforts in the siege. Afterwards, a lengthy account of how all of the towers of Nicosia fell, similar to the one that I said in the previous episode, from the account of Falchetti. And at one point, Diedo resumes saying that, quote, the doors were opened when the Turks sprang out with their weapons upon the defenseless crowd and butchered them all, the chiefs, the bishop, and every fugitive. Such was the lamentable end of the wretched citizens, such the tragic fate of Nicosia, a city famed as a fortress, glorying in its buildings and widely known for its riches. Its happy position, its pleasant climate, the gifts showered on it by nature, the added charms of art, had given it a place among the fairest, strongest, and most renowned cities of Europe. The fortress was theirs, and the Turks set themselves to search it throughout, and to work upon the inhabitants, their houses and churches, the impious barbarities which such nations use towards the cities they conquer. Virgins were violated, matrons dishonored, nobles and plebeians thrown together into chains, sanctuaries defiled, holy relics scattered and trampled underfoot. Yet did not this suffice? The victorious soldiery, satiated with booty, blood, and lust, gave further vent to their execrable savagery by tearing from their graves the bones and dust of the dead and scattering them in fiendish rage over the streets. The 9th day of September saw the fall of the city. The attacks had lasted 15 days, during which time so fierce was the fighting, and so many were killed both within and without the walls, that perhaps hardly more lives were sacrificed in the final combat, though in that one day were butchered more than 20,000 persons of every age and sex. Great was the treasure sent by Mustafa to Constantinople, in presents to the Sultan and chief pashas, and the number of prisoners of distinction was not inconsiderable. When the greed of the commanders and their troops was satisfied, and a garrison of 4,000 soldiers had taken up its quarters in the city, the Turkish army left Nicosia, on its way to Famagusta, the only town which remained faithful to the Venetians, for the other districts of the kingdom, as well as the hill folk, had quietly accepted the Turkish yoke. Unquote. And so ends the account of Diedo, who painted a grim picture of what happened at Nicosia, and the fact that Mustafa was quite right in deciding to conquer Nicosia, the capital, first, and not Famagusta. It was clear that Nicosia was not well equipped at all to face such a fierce army that was led by Mustafa. We're talking about more than 100,000 soldiers, thousands of pioneers who worked day and night to undermine the bastions and the towers of Nicosia. And the city lacked the proper fortifications, lacked also, again, soldiers, and also were led at the top of the hierarchy was an incompetent lieutenant called Niccolo Dandolo, which I keep mentioning. And a lot of historians, again, attribute the loss of Nicosia and implicitly of Cyprus to his incompetence and lack of proper strategic defensive thought. So begins the account of Paruta about the siege of Famagusta. Quote, "The city of Nicosia being taken and sacked, Mustafa, leaving 4,000 foot soldiers for its defense, sent the army towards Famagusta. For after the fall of Nicosia, the Turks easily and with no further resistance made themselves masters of the whole rest of the island, because the other places, which were weak and without men to defend them, followed the fortunes of the conquerors and surrendered at once. Cherines made no more delay or difficulty than the rest, although the commandant, Giovan Maria Mudasso, and Captain Alfonso Palazzo had just before, following the advice and prayers of the garrison of Famagusta, declared their intention of holding out as long as they could. The mountain folk did the same. There came at once to find Mustafa and to swear obedience to him Scipione Carafa, Paolo Singlitico, and other nobles, accompanied by many Greek priests and a great troop of peasants, so that throughout the kingdom all that remained faithful to the Signory of Venice was the one city of Famagusta. Mustafa led his army forwards and pitched his camp in the village of Pomodamo, 3 miles from the city, and every day caused many Turks to ride to and fro in sight of those within, carrying on lances the heads of divers notable persons killed in Nicosia, to terrify the soldiers and to shake their determination to await an attack and to stand a siege. Next, he moved up a little towards the city, making trenches with baskets full of sand, because the earth there was a little fit for the work. But the garrison made vigorous sallies to skirmish with the enemy and harassed them to that extent that twice they drove them from their trenches. Moreover, with the guns of the fortress, they destroyed 3 forts which the Turks had raised with great speed in suitable positions, to wit, at St. George, at Precipole, and at the Torre dell'Oca. As it turned out, no small hurt was caused thereby to the besieged, because in a very few days their ammunition was greatly diminished, no less than 50,000 pounds of powder being consumed. But winter was coming, on which would hinder the siege, already seen to be a long and difficult matter, and part of the host was to be employed to man the galleys, on account of the news received of the junction of the Christian fleets. So Mustafa, who was a little anxious to try another fall with fortune, in which he might impair the glory won at Nicosia, kept treating in various ways with the inhabitants to persuade them to come to some agreement. Thus, he allowed Giovanni Sosomeno, who had been taken prisoner at Nicosia, to enter the city under the pretense of collecting money for his ransom, and urged them much to surrender. He was to say to the governors and captains that, as they did not wish of themselves to decide on giving up the city to him, they ought, while the thing was still practicable, to write to the Signory of Venice to show them how matters stood, how difficult it was for them to withstand so huge a host, and to be content to use the opportunity, yielding what they could in no wise keep, and so to arrange with the Grand Signior to preserve their dominions. After the same manner, Mustafa caused certain letters to be written, as though they came from the chiefs in Famagusta, and to make them fall into the hands of the ambassador at Constantinople. But the chiefs and the people of Famagusta were staunch in their resolve to defend themselves to the end. They lent no ear to these arguments, and instead of begging the Senate to surrender the city, they resolved urgently to demand aid for its defense, and that the state of things and their immediate wants might be better understood, to dispatch to the Venice Messer Niccolo Donato, who had been sent on a mission to the island, and was still with his 2 galleys in the harbour of Famagusta, with whom there reached Venice Monsignor Girolamo Ragazzoni, bishop of the city, a man fully acquainted with the position and admirably adapted for his duty." Unquote. And for about 2 pages, Paruta proceeds and gives a bit of a historical description of Famagusta, Venetian Famagusta, what was before as well, why it was arguably the most important Venetian outpost in all of Cyprus, despite of the fact that Nicosia was the capital. Now, there were debates before that the Venetians and the Senate tried to move the capital from Nicosia to Famagusta, but fearing unrest among the common folk, also of the nobility, they decided to not do that. In my recent research about the fall of Cyprus, to the Ottomans, I like to discuss and bring into discussion the contrast between what I like to call native Nicosia, the part of Cyprus belonging to the Cypriot nobility, to the Greek Orthodox part of the island, and colonial Famagusta, because Famagusta represented, as I said, the most the wealthiest part of Cyprus. And from previous accounts, again, Famagusta was much better organized because of the fact that it had an Italian militia. Also, Famagusta was much harder to conquer for the Ottomans because, unlike at Nicosia, where you had the incompetent Niccolò Dandolo leading things, at Famagusta you had Marcantonio Bragadino, the captain general of Famagusta. And within early modern Venetian history, he's quite revered, close to the point of sanctification. For sure, he is considered a martyr of the Venetian Republic in the fight against the Ottoman Empire. And from Paruta's account, you will see why. Paruta resumes, quote, "The hope of fame and of ample reward was always present to inspirit them in their defense. Marcantonio Bragadino, the captain or governor general of Famagusta, using great and praiseworthy diligence in this as in every other matter. Seeing the danger increase, as the enemy drew nearer to the walls, Bragadino endeavored with spirited speeches to establish the courage of the besieged, showing them that the time was come for them to make signal proof of that true valor to which for months past he had seen them inclined. No glory that warriors had earned in our age was greater than that which was reserved for them in defending against the might of the Ottoman Empire, a fortress so far from other Christian lands, and in preserving with it a flourishing kingdom from enslavement by barbarians." Addressing himself to the Italian troops, he said, "Why, my brave comrades, have you come here from a far distant country, exposing yourselves to certain hardships and great danger in so long a voyage, if not to give fitting proof of your courage, and by surpassing merit to earn the supreme honors of warfare? Now indeed the very chance which you have so eagerly desired is put before you. Your endurance, your diligence, in short, all the martial values have here the widest and noblest field. For this city is assailed and encompassed by foes of great repute, and the result of the siege is watched throughout the world with the greatest anxiety. But my confidence in you, citizens and others who are enrolled amongst our troops, is no less great, for you have given clear proof not only of loyalty and constancy, but of true courage, in performing with the zeal and skill of tried soldiers all your military duties. Your generous hearts will never allow that in the defense of what is your own, your wives, your children, your goods, others shall take the lead. With noble emulation, each man will seek to have a larger share in the toil, to be the first to expose himself to peril. Do not let the enemy's numbers frighten you for a moment. They are certainly less than what we hear by report, or what is indicated by a pompous array of empty tents. Most of them, or at least the bravest of them, are exhausted by toil, or have returned home to enjoy the riches acquired in the siege of Nicosia. What happened in that city should waken you vigilance rather than alarm, for we know certainly that it was not the valor or industry of the enemy which gave them the victory, but the negligence of the besieged, who appear to have thought that walls alone, not the stout hearts of men, are the bulwarks of cities. The hope of the succor, which we expect at once, might give courage even to the cowards. Yet I would not have one of you fix your thoughts on this, lest it should distract you. From your daring somewhat of praise, for it is on yourselves that each man must found his hopes, believing that he carries his fortune in his own right hand. This is the part of men truly strong and brave. Innumerable are the examples which show us how valor and firmness have overcome difficulties which looked insuperable. But besides the confidence which rests on mere human resolve, we have a greater, a livelier hope of deliverance and victory, in that we are defending a just and pious cause against impious and treacherous foes, to whom God's providence has so far allowed some measure of success, so that, with a chance in the fortune of war, their fall may be the greater. We have then every argument, human and divine, to persuade us to drive fear from our breasts, and to hope for a good and prosperous issue to our efforts." Unquote. Loud and cheery shouts from all present greeted these words. Everyone wished to show his own steadfastness, and to encourage the rest to bear readily the toils and perils before them. The captains then, to inflame the troops by example as well as by words, made the best possible distribution of the posts, and determined to have their own quarters on the ramparts, just below the platform, so as to be ready at any moment for a call to arms, and to share in their daily work and risk. May was nearly half past. The preparations were everywhere complete, and the spirits of the soldiers, countrymen and townsmen alike, were wonderfully ready to make or take the attack, when one morning at sunrise they saw from the walls all the enemy's forts and trenches full of innumerable flags and lances, and heard a roar of men and of drums and of other instruments. A little later, the Turks began a furious discharge of muskets and cannon, which they kept up throughout the day, hoping that their fury would inspire their own troops with courage and ours with fear. From the first, the plan of the enemy was to break down the city's defenses. Their shots were aimed at the parapets, but the besieged, with wonderful speed, repaired and strengthened them, using earth wetted and stamped into boxes and casks, with excellent results. Gradually, however, the Turks took lower aim and did great damage to the walls. It became necessary to carry into the city by night the stones dislodged during the day, a work of incredible toil, but which was kept up until the Turks entered the fosse. For they had already driven their trenches up to the counterscarp, and while they threw earth into the ditch in front of them, on one side and on the other from a small platform, they pierced the wall of the counterscarp and made a safe entrance into the ditch, and right up to the walls, keeping out of reach of the cannon of the demilunes, which fired sideways and exposed only to the slighter fire of the platforms. In the city, powder was beginning to fall short, and had to be used with care, so that the gunners were forbidden to fire without express orders from their commanders, and these were only given when absolutely necessary. The chief means of harassing the enemy lay in the fireworks, which were hurled down on them from the walls, throwing them into disorder and killing many. Iron balls too were used, full of very fine powder, which burst and killed many persons at once. Yet all these devices could not keep the enemy away from the walls, which they began to undermine in several places, especially near the arsenal. Some of these mines were discovered by the besieged. The powder supplied their needs most opportunely, and what was laid for their ruin helped their defense. But the Turks had already posted large bodies of men in the ditch, where they were lodged comfortably in their tents, secured from attack by the vigilant watch of those who manned the nearest trenches, who were so careful to observe the slightest movement of any of our soldiers that not a man could appear on the walls, but he was immediately marked down and killed by a musket ball. They did not neglect their mines, one of which under the demilune of the arsenal did fatal damage, while it showed signally the steadiness of our soldiers, or rather their pitiable situation. Paruta then goes on to describe the multiple small sieges upon the walls of Famagusta, especially at the arsenal. Bear in mind, we just discussed what happened in May. All of this went on until August, so at least 3.5 months of continuous battering of the walls from the Ottoman siege forces. The Venetian defense of Famagusta under Marcantonio Bragadin was remarkable, but unable to receive any assistance from either Venice or the Holy League, it became a problem because the walls would last as much as their defenders would last, and their numbers were shrinking, they were out of gunpowder, and they were out of supplies. So by mid-August or so, the spirit of the defenders of Famagusta was almost broken, and it became clear that the people of Famagusta, the leaders also, had to find a compromise, to surrender to the forces so they may still get out of alive of this horrendous siege. And at one point, Paruta returns by saying that they, the people of Famagusta, asked them in all humility, in all affection, in the name of their most loyal city, that the authorities would consent to treat with the enemy, a course the Turks themselves were daily proposing, and under honorable conditions endeavor to preserve what might yet perhaps be left of so great and noble a kingdom. Having heard the prayer of the people, the magistrates and principal commanders debated among themselves what should be done. Opinions were divided. One of them stoutly insisted that, quote, they ought to die with their arms in their hands, to make one great sally by night, to fall on the Turks unawares, and dying to avenge their own death by the blood of the foe. Death in any case, so slippery was the enemy's faith, would be equally certain, but not equally glorious. No argument would persuade him that the Turks would keep the faith they plighted. To some understanding, they were driven by need, not by their will. Yet it might befall that in making one, they might in a measure tarnish or impair the fame and glory won by such heroic toil. Unquote. Paruta resumes, on the other side, there were those who said that it was unbefitting officers who had been appointed to guard the city, and to govern its inhabitants for their safety and welfare, to show themselves more ruthless than their very enemies. It was perfectly clear that the Turkish commanders were moved at this juncture to propose a truce solely by a desire to save the city from rapine, and the citizens from slaughter, fearing that if they took it by violence, they would be impotent to restrain the fury of their troops. Again, it was the duty of brave men not to allow themselves to be forced to acts of cowardice or failure of duty by the fear of death, but to wish uselessly to throw away their lives was to show mad obstinacy rather than true valor. What they had done in the defense of the fortress was so notable, so plain, that none but those who envied them would dare to reflect on their courage. Where glory is greatest, its spur is most sharply felt, but virtue has this privilege to be its own reward. The soldiers had satisfied every call of duty, for up to the very last they had preserved to their prince his stronghold. Now what could their chiefs do more for them than to save for other emergencies men, every one of whom his suffering and experience had made a brave and capable leader? They must not, in this case, fear so much for the observance of the truce, for they had often seen, in the capture of Rhodes, and in various engagements in Hungary that the Turks, barbarians though they were used to honor even in their enemies' valor in war. These arguments prevailed at last, and after long debate it was resolved to capitulate upon honourable conditions. On the 1st of August, after much parleying, in which an Italian standard-bearer, a prisoner in the Turkish camp, was the intermediary, it was decided that, after we had first sent our hostages, 2 leading officers from the camp should enter the city to treat about the details of the truce and of the surrender. Meanwhile, hostilities were to be suspended on both sides. Sundry white flags were hoisted both within and without the city in a sign of truce, and the following day two Kiaya, a kind of master of the household among the Turks, and one of Mustafa Pasha, and the other of the Aga of the Janissaries, entered the city on horseback, and with them 6 Janissaries only on foot, all splendidly armed and clothed. From our side, there went our Ercole Martinengo and Matteo Colti, a citizen of Famagusta, attended by 4 soldiers. Immediately outside the city, they were met by a son of Mustafa, with a large escort of soldiers, mounted and on foot, who conducted them into his father's presence. Mustafa Pasha welcomed them with ceremonious speeches, presented them 2 robes of gold brocade, and sent them to lodge in the pavilion of the Aga of the Janissaries. But it is worthy of remark that these men, who had borne so many hardships and despaired, as it were, of safety, and who should now have been consoled by seeing the end of so great troubles, showed into their looks and words only the deepest sadness, as though their minds pictured to them calamities yet to come. The officers who came to discuss the conditions showed themselves most ready to concede all our proposals. These were, shortly, that the soldiers should be transported safely on Turkish vessels to the island of Candia, with permission to carry with them their arms and all their property, 5 pieces of artillery and 3 horses belonging to the 3 chief commanders were specially named. That all the inhabitants should in like manner be free to move with their families and property whither they would, but those who remained should be safe in their persons, their property, and their honour from the insolence of the troops. Thus, in a single day, the conditions of surrender were discussed, arranged, and ratified. The Turks appeared to wish to carry them out quickly and strictly, and sent at once into the harbour about 40 vessels, upon which the sick and wounded were first embarked, while the able-bodied soldiers kept their posts on the second line of defence and allowed the Turks to make no forward movement. But as soon as our men got beyond the trenches and saw and were seen by the enemy's host, it would be difficult to describe the wonder begotten by causes altogether different in one and the other army. Our men were staggered at the prodigious number of the force they saw in the Turkish camp. For over 3 miles from the city it stretched over a vast circuit, and was everywhere so full of troops that the turbans, which on every side showed white above the trenches, covered the ground like snowflakes. The Turks, on the other hand, when they saw that the defending force was so small in numbers, the emaciated bodies and pale faces of our soldiers, who seemed as though they could hardly stand, much less offer so long and gallant a resistance to a foe, marvelled at their courage and felt some touch of shame. They let natural pity and the generous workings of true courage have their way. They began to offer them refreshments, to speak courteously, to praise their steadfastness, and to encourage them to hope for the best. Meanwhile, the Greeks and Albanians were ready to embark with their families, and other detachments of soldiers were already on board other vessels, so that on the 4th of August the city was left free to the Turks. As soon as they entered, they began to use all kinds of violence towards the citizens. Bragadino informed Mustafa of this and complained, and prayed that he would show that he observed the conditions and respected his plighted faith by putting some check on the insolence of his soldiery. He begged that more ships might be sent to take the rest of the people, and promised that he would then come himself to bring him the keys of the city. This message was entrusted to Nestore Martinengo, a youth of great spirit who from the beginning of the war had served Famagusta under the banner of his uncle Girolamo Martinengo, and had been employed on various duties, always earning high praise from his intelligence and courage. He went to the Pasha and obtained forthwith an order to the soldiers who had entered the city to abstain from all violence, and a promise that 2 other vessels should be sent at once into the harbor to embark our soldiers. He was desired to tell Bragadino that Mustafa would be glad to see him. He wished to know in person and to face a man of whose great worth he had had such proof, and to whose valor he would everywhere warmly testify. Without further delay, on the evening of the same day, leaving Tiepolo in the city, all the other principal officers, to wit Bragadino, Baglione, Martinengo, and Antonio Querini, a noble Venetian, accompanied by other captains and a few Greek gentlemen, went out on horseback, attended by 40 musketeers on foot. The General Bragadino rode in front of the rest under a red umbrella, dressed in purple with the ordinary robes of his office, and followed by the others named. When they arrived at the pavilion of the Pasha, they were received with great ceremony, and their arms being laid aside, they were introduced into the presence of Mustafa. He conversed with them for some time on various matters, disassembling his inmost thoughts, but at last, trying to find some pretext for giving effect to the savagery which his fierce spirit had conceived, he required some guarantee that the vessels which he lent from them would be sent back. Bragadino replied that he was not bound to this surrender under the capitulation, nor had he officers whom he could leave behind whom Mustafa would accept as hostages. Mustafa pointed to Querini and added that he must remain in the camp. The person of this youth declared his courage and noble birth. This, and the fact that he was the son of Niccolo Querini, who had been in charge of the fortifications of Nicosia, and had been given his family name to one of its bastions, made him conspicuous among his companions and better known to Mustafa. Bragadino firmly refused of his own free will to give him up. The Pasha could no longer control his passion and burst into a torrent of abuse, fiercely accusing our men of having put to death certain Mussulmans, prisoners in their hands contrary to the usages of war and the dictates of humanity. His talk added fuel to his rage, and he ordered them all to be bound. They were led out of the pavilion. He set free the hostages who were still in the camp, and caused Baglione, Martinengo, Querini, and the rest to be hacked in pieces by his soldiers, a pitiful spectacle, and a fate all unworthy of those brave men, who might have hoped to receive from soldiers, enemies though they were, rewards, not punishment, for their valor shown in war. Bragadino was reserved for the greater torments. He was obliged to witness this cruelty, and many times to endure the pains of death before he was released from life. For they made him stretch out his neck, but, unwilling to kill him on the spot, merely cut off his ears. Then follows a grueling account of how Marcantonio Bragadino was slowly executed by the Turkish forces, who used the pretext that in May to June and July, the Venetians would have taken some Turkish hostages and killed them, which is to this day disputed. Nobody knew if that was actually the case. This was the case of Mustafa losing his cool and probably being unable to control all of his soldiers. The city of Famagusta, Paruta resumes, he says, "The city was thus acquired. Order was taken at once carefully to clear the ditches of the ruins of the walls, to raise all the forts and fill all the trenches outside, and to repair all that had been destroyed within. Thus the fortress was soon restored to its original condition and made even more secure and defensible than it had been before. Mustafa Pasha put the Bey of Rhodes in charge of the city, and on the 24th of September left Cyprus, returning victorious and triumphant to Constantinople, where he was received with high honors and universal joy. Yet the victory had cost the Turks dear, for they had lost, so report said, more than 50,000 men, and among them many commanders of high rank and their best warriors." And so ends Paruta's account of the siege of Famagusta, which was by all means the most difficult part of the Ottoman campaign in Cyprus. Future episode will be dedicated to Marcantonio Bragadino, his valor, and why he's such an important figure, not only in Venetian Cyprus history, but in Venetian history overall in the 16th century. All of the previous accounts paint a rather complicated picture of what happened in Cyprus. It was the poor administration of the Venetians which of course led to the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus. The main problem was that Nicosia had been easily conquered, leaving Famagusta, although the strongest fort on the island, with a defense of less than a couple of thousand, to face 100,000 soldiers that had constant supply routes from Caramania, from Syria, from Egypt, and no reinforcements from Venice or the Holy League, bar one exception of Marco Quirini in 1570. Thus, by 1571, by September of that year, Venice had lost one of its most important outposts, one of its most important dominions. Cyprus was vital for Venetian trade, a proxy between the Levant and the Signory of Venice. Cyprus had valuable primary resources and provided a lot of tax money as well. The Republic of Venice, upon hearing the news that Famagusta had been conquered as well, was in deep mourning for several days. The victory of Lepanto helped a bit in terms of prestige, but it never recovered Cyprus. In 1573, the Venetians were forced to capitulate and surrender, and they had to re-establish trade with the Ottomans. So the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, also known as the War of Cyprus, had ended very badly for the Venetians. They lost Cyprus, they didn't win the war, and they had to pay compensation of more than 300,000 ducats war reparations for the Turks. It is true that because it was such a long and difficult siege, the Ottomans were just happy to keep Cyprus and not proceed forward to Venice's last outpost in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that was Crete. That would be conquered in the next century. But this conflict proved that Venice, even with the reluctant help of Philip II's Spain and an exhausted and financially drained papacy, Venice could not do much to stop the Ottoman expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean. I hope you enjoyed this episode very much, and I hope you stay tuned for future episodes of the Wanderer's History podcast.